Well, actually, Elaine, I can take care of it for you.
Thank you.
It's a little microphone on top.
There we go. Yeah, no, and the phone it's a little different. And the phone is, I think it's star 6 to mute. All right. So, we're on the, well, actually, Elaine, I can take care of it for you. Okay. All right. All right, there we go. So we will, now let's do this. Okay. So this is a very sort of emotional debate now in our country, and I think it's a very difficult debate for a lot of us to understand. And I am aware that I'm coming at this debate from a very particular position as someone who is very committed to LGBTQ equality and protection, equal protection under the law, and so on and so forth. And I think I read another article yesterday, actually this morning, which I also thought was very interesting on this topic. It was written by a Republican Christian guy, mainstream Christian, not evangelical, and an atheist guy. I think he's probably a Democrat, but he's gay. And they wrote this article together talking about trying to find some sort of balance between religious freedom and LGBTQ rights, which is really opened up my mind even more on this topic. So just to say that this is not a topic that is, obviously this conversation is not going to be, is not finished. This topic will continue to be an issue, I think, in the courts and, of course, in the larger culture for quite a while. So let's get started. So Jennifer Finney Boylan is a transgender writer and columnist, and she is. I actually got to see her speak at Radcliffe probably now 2 or 3 years ago. And she's just a fascinating person with a great story. And she has a couple of memoirs talking about her transition, and very worthwhile looking at if you're interested in the topic of transgender people. Definitely a good place to start. So she writes Harry Potter and the Scales of Justice. So on Monday, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of an LGBTQ plaintiff 6-3. All right. So I used to think people like you should be, exterminated, the nice young man said to me. But after listening to you speak, I've really changed my mind. I mean, I just want to stop for a second on this story. And just try to imagine yourself in this type of a position, right? Where someone sort of, and obviously she's maybe using this word nice with a slight bit of irony, but I think she probably also means it literally. He's a nice young man who has, these sort of genocidal thoughts or just extermination kind of thoughts. It's so shocking. This was after a lecture I'd given a few years ago at a college in Ohio. He looked at me proudly, clearly hoping I'd be cheered that my words had opened his heart. But that word, exterminated, tempered my happiness somewhat. Sometimes I forget that there are people who want to wipe me off the face of the earth. I forget, even though the Trump administration does its best to remind me every day. For the last 3.5 years, this administration has done all it can to make the lives of queer people more miserable. I suppose it's trying to push back on our gay agenda, you know, the one in which people like me keep asking for special rights. But what are the special rights I want? The same one everyone else has. What's on my gay agenda? It is the hope to live my life in peace. Yesterday, the Supreme Court finally issued its ruling on Bostock v. Clayton County, a long-awaited decision that would determine whether it was legal to fire workers for being gay, bisexual, or transgender. It was with happy surprise that I saw the court had ruled in favor of the LGBTQ plaintiffs 6-3. Remarkably, the majority opinion was written by Justice Neil Gorsuch, the man whom Senator Mitch McConnell had wrangled onto the court after refusing to even consider President Barack Obama's more liberal nominee, Merrick Garland. Even in his dissent, Justice Brett Kavanaugh gave us a little rainbow shout-out, admitting that gay men and lesbians have worked hard for many decades to achieve equal treatment in fact and in law. They have exhibited extraordinary vision, tenacity, and grit, battling often steep odds in the legislative and judicial arenas, not to mention in their daily lives. That was nice of him, although it'd be nicer if his words hadn't erased bisexual and trans Americans. It'd also have been nice if he'd, voted yes. But a win is a win. Until then, it had been a thoroughly miserable June for transgender people and our allies, and that's not even counting the pandemic, the national economic collapse, and the curse of police violence. Last week, J.K. Rowling, I'm sorry, I messed up here. Last week, the author J.K. Rowling felt it necessary to unveil a screed against trans folks that ran to nearly 4,000 words and read like a greatest hits of false statements and groundless fears. She stated that trans men transition because being a woman is hard. They do not. She stated that trans women pose a threat to others in the ladies' room. We do not. In fact, more Republican congressmen have been busted for causing trouble in public laboratories than trans women, but no one wants to throw them out of the Coast Guard. The effect of Ms. Rowling's manifesto was immediate and passionate. I heard from many young LGBTQ people who had grown up reading her books who responded to her words with sadness and fury. Surely Ms. Rowling was familiar with a series of books about a group of outcasts who were treated differently simply because who they were. It was nice that Emma Watson, Daniel Radcliffe, and Rupert Grint all have released eloquent and unambiguous statements in support of trans people. I was especially cheered to see Mr. Grint join the fray. Surely, Ms. Rowling, when you've lost Ron Weasley, you've lost everybody. For those of you who are not familiar with the Harry Potter books, Ron Weasley is Harry Potter's best friend, who's is seen as sort of a middle of the road kind of a guy. But it's one thing to contend with hate from a famous children's author, and another when it comes from the most powerful government in the world. Later that week, the Trump administration finalized the change that had been threatening to the civil rights provisions of the Affordable Care Act, removing trans people from its protections. In the future, the Department of Health and Human Services will apply those provisions only on the basis of male or female and as determined by biology. Does it not occur to these people that trans people are who they are in part as a function of biology, or that there is by now a broad understanding that gender is complex, shaped by a wide range of factors in addition to chromosomes? I suspect not. Science has never been the chief concern of social conservatives or of this administration. This rule change serves no other purpose than to target and to discriminate against LGBTQ people, said Sasha Blueshirt, an attorney at Lambda Legal, an organization dedicated to defending the civil rights of queer people. The cruelty is the point. As Pride months go, you could say this particular June has failed to cheery. And yet there are signs of hope. Tens of thousands of people gathered nationwide on Sunday to take part in marches supporting trans people of color. This was in response to the murder of 2 trans women of color last week. Dominique Remy Fells, 27, of Philadelphia, and Rhea Milton, 25, of Cincinnati. I believe in my power, the activist Raquel Willis said at the rally in Brooklyn. I believe in your power. I believe in our power. I believe in Black trans power. The plague of murder and violence against trans people, at least 14 souls killed so far this year, is a national shame. But to see so many people gathered to fight back did lift my spirits. And I was cheered, of course, to see the Supreme Court rule in our favor on Monday. Still, it's infuriating that this case ever made it all the way to the Supreme Court in the first place. I am tired of participating in debates about whether or not I deserve the same rights as everybody else. I am tired of famous authors punching down to hurt and dehumanize some of the most vulnerable people on earth. I'm tired of being erased. I'm tired of having to look into the eyes of a young man who has just told me proudly that I changed his mind about whether or not I should be exterminated, like a deer tick or a carpet beetle. As the Supreme Court decision says, it matters not what someone is born, but what they grow to be. And every human life is worth the same and worth saving. Just kidding. That wasn't the court. That was from the books of J.K. Rowling. All right, so let's see. I'm going to stop the share for a moment and get people's. Hello, Ren. Please, if you'd like to comment, please feel free to raise your hand. Yeah, good to see you, Ren. You can, at this point, why don't we let people unmute themselves and speak if you'd like to, and if we have a lot of people speaking at once, I'll try to be the traffic cop.
Sandy.
Go ahead, Barbara. Oh, Sandy. Go ahead, Sandy, and then Barbara. Great.
Could you define the difference between trans and just gay or bisexual?
Sure. I'll do my best. And anyone here who thinks that my definitions are not accurate, please feel free to raise your voice and let me know. We can. Yes.
I need to leave.
Okay, Elaine. Great to hear your voice. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
So a person who's gay is generally someone who is a man who will fall in love with other men. Just like a lesbian is generally a woman who will fall in love with other women. A trans person is when people talk about trans people, they're not talking about what we might call sexual preference or sexual orientation, right? They're talking about gender, which is a different category. And so people like me are what are called cisgender people, right? People who were born as and assigned a particular gender when they were born. So when I was born, everyone said, "Oh, it's a boy," and I am comfortable and happy being a man. Not all the time, of course, but but I don't think anyone's happy being what they are all the time. Someone who is not comfortable with the gender that they were assigned at birth may choose to become a trans person, or and sometimes it's not a choice, right? Very often it's just they know from their earliest days that they were born into the wrong body, and so there's a complicated process of transitioning from that the gender that they were assigned at birth to their new gender, and that transitioning is and so this causes a problem, right? For some people, especially the Trump administration, for some reason, which seems weirdly obsessed with this topic. There's this sort of insistence that whatever gender you were assigned at birth, that's your gender, and you're not allowed to change it or to pretend that you're something different. So, does that help, Sandy?
Somewhat, because the whole view of bisexual and transgender has changed over time.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, these on one hand, yes, our understanding and our capacity to our capacity to acknowledge and accept people for who they are certainly does change over time. But my guess, right, is that like other aspects of human nature, these different, even though we might have different ways of classifying the various genders and the various sexual orientations and so on and so forth, right, that the biological bases for these different genders and these different sexual orientations has not changed. There's many very well attested cases, right, of women living as men and men living as women all through history, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean that they, consider themselves, the first thing to remember, right, is that you can't conflate gender and sexual orientation, right? Those are two very separate parts of a person's identity, right? I actually heard, there was a transgender activist who came to speak at a conference that I was at, and she was talking about how to know someone's sex, you have to look at their genitals, and if you want to know someone's sexual orientation, you had to look at their heart, and if you wanted to know their gender, most likely you had to look in her brain, his or her brain, right, or their brain, because it seems increasingly clear from the research that people's gender identity is something that happens in the brain, right, separate from their sexual identity, which, is, for the majority of people in the world, that is clear, right, but, at birth, although there are many people who are born with indistinct genitalia and are very often assigned at birth according to the whim of the doctor, rather than being left as intersex. So basic. A lesbian is a woman who loves other women. A gay man is a man who loves other men. Someone who's bisexual or pansexual now seems to be a growing term, right? Is they fall in love with a person. They don't fall in love with a particular category of people. They just fall in love with a person, whether that be a man or a woman or someone who doesn't identify as a particular gender. And transgender, as I said, is someone who transitions from one gender to another. And then there's the category queer or gender. Sometimes it's called gender queer, right? Which means that they don't feel comfortable in any specific checkbox, right? And so this is why increasingly you'll see in questionnaires, you'll see what's your gender? It'll be male, female, and prefer not to answer, or doesn't identify as any particular gender. All right. So any other questions, Sandy?
No, I think that's good.
Great. Okay. Wonderful. Barbara.
I think I'd like Mimi to talk first because I think she has something to say.
Oh, did you have something to say, Mimi? Go ahead, Mimi.
Well, I have a lot to say. What I would say, but I'm not, let's say. I think I'll attempt to get it out of the theoretical and talk more personally because I am a lesbian. And what occurred to me while you were speaking, Rabbi, was that, and I've thought about this a fair amount, I don't know what I would have done if I were born now. If I was 5 years old now, I don't know, because I am someone who, from as early as I can remember, thought I was from another planet because I knew I was a girl, but everything I wanted to do was what was described in this, let's use the words patriarchal society, as male defined. I've been, I'm all over the place with that. In some ways, I'm more comfortable with men. In some ways, I'm more comfortable with, it's all over. So I am so happy for these younger people who have so much more choice, who are able to just be themselves however that comes out. And, and yeah, that's, I'm where I am now, it doesn't really matter because I'm happy with where I am. But boy, it was a miserable growing up.
Yeah. And I've heard so many stories of people growing up, and the words maybe that really get me are, I feel like I was from another planet. Right? It's this feeling of just not belonging somehow, of not being in the same. Now, is there an echo? Is that...
No, you're good.
Okay. Go ahead.
And that's the other thing when. With the Supreme Court decision, this might seem like a leap, but it isn't to me. The Supreme Court decision, everybody's, whoa, and I'm happy, but I'm also pissed off because you have to make some kind of, like the woman said, you have to go to the high court to decide that I'm a human.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, no, that on one hand, you're absolutely right that this is, this shouldn't even been a question, but somehow it remains a question for people, and I, beyond just sort of, again and again, re-explaining, and again, sort of just reminding people that if a person is in the world, then they deserve the same rights as everybody else, right? It should not be there should not be any second-class citizens. And of course, in this country, we have too many categories of second-class citizens, and so we need to constantly be pushing back against that. Go ahead, Barbara.
All I wanted to say was that I was terribly disappointed in J.K. Rowling because I really love the Harry Potter books. I like the philosophy behind them and what they represent. And I was just astounded that she turned out to say things like that about gay people and transgender people. It just somehow doesn't fit.
Yeah, it's very strange, and I don't entirely get it because, she made it clear that Albus Dumbledore is gay. That Albus Dumbledore is the headmaster of the Hogwarts school in the story, and sort of the held up as as a really idealized figure. And then she has fairly. She has those statements in her books, right? That Jennifer Finney Boylan pulled out that indicate, right, that she has a basic understanding that people are people, right? And where you're born does not matter nearly as much as what you make of yourself, right? Which is like, but I also think that there is a way in which this issue of transgender is very threatening to certain people, and it might be threatening to everybody. I'm not sure at some level, unless it might sort of be along the lines of what we see with gay rights in general, right? Is that as people you know, one of the, I can only imagine that among the reasons why I'm comfortable with transgender folks is because I've had the opportunity to work with them and to become friends with them. And so I know just from my kishkas, right, just from my guts, right, that they're just other people, right? They're like people like all the other people that I've known. Some of them I agree with, some of them I disagree with, some of them I like, some of them drive me crazy, right? And so, and as soon as people become actual people, right, as opposed to, like Mimi says, abstractions, right, then it's, you know, so I've often thought that, you know, now that people have, you know, there's so many people, say, even at CCB, right, so many people who have gay grandchildren or gay children, gay grandchildren, right? It's just, they're just part of our communities, part of our families. Now that I have multiple friends whose children are transgender, and I have a multitude of transgender acquaintances and friends, you know, it's just, you know, so, but maybe J.K. Rowling doesn't have that for whatever reason.
I don't think I don't think that's it, and it's a complicated thing because there are many women who call themselves feminists who have some kind of idea about the sanctity of women, and the way I can relate to that is back in the early 70s when I was living in Northampton. I was a part of a collective that established a women's restaurant, and it was women only. And the big debate was whether a trans person, and this is the early 70s, whether that person should be allowed to come in. And it has to do with the preciousness and sort of, you know, being a woman means something that has to be defended, that I think that she's still hung up in.
Yeah, right. That was actually her sort of explicit take, right, was that she prefers to reserve woman, right, for, as she puts it, people who menstruate, which, right. You know, it's sort of like, I just don't understand like it, because obviously not all women menstruate. You know, some people grow out of it, right? Many women stop menstruating, right? It's just, you know, sometimes it's a function of age, sometimes because of a function as a function of surgery, right? Or some other health situation, right? And we don't stop calling those people women, right? Because they no longer menstruate, right? So maybe I'm missing something there, but it's but that doesn't hold a tremendous amount of water. But I do think you're right, Mimi, because that's exactly what she made reference to. Yeah. Anyone else would like to add something? Go ahead, Naomi.
A couple of things. There are cultures in which the idea of people who are neither male nor female, or who may be both, are accepted as part of the culture. We happen to be one of them. In terms of, I think you really have to somehow, like you do separation of a lot of things, you got to separate the Harry Potter novels from Rowland. You know,
yeah.
That's one thing, there's something.
Naomi, you just muted yourself.
How unfortunate. The thing that fascinated me about Gorsuch's opinion was his acknowledgement that regardless of what the original founders or the original writers of the legislation may have or may not have been able to imagine, the concept of sex has expanded. And even if they could not at the time imagine that this would be an issue, it's an issue now simply because of the use of the word has expanded, which gives me a little hope for this guy on the court. Yeah. Because he's supposed to be an originalist. Okay, what he's doing is taking the original word and saying, yeah, but it's changed. So
Right.
this could get interesting at some point.
It really could, and that's actually it's a great it's a great segue to the other piece, which we can turn to now. But I want to make sure that other people don't want to say something. Renee and Jean, would you like to add anything? Okay. No? Okay, great. And Ren, are you all good? Okay, I'll take that as meaning that you're good to move on. So I'll share with you the other article. Ren, would you like to say something? No? Okay, good. All right, so I'll share with you the other article here. And I thought this was really a nice dissection and getting towards what Naomi was talking about. Okay. All right. So what does sex mean? Right? And this is a very interesting point. So just as background, right? Why is this word sex important? Right? Because the statute says you may not fire someone on the basis of their sex. Right? So now I just got done saying, right, that someone who's transgender, it doesn't really have to do with their sex, right? It has to do with their gender identity. But right, essentially what they're saying is that if you were born as a girl and you transition to being a man, right? Then it's because of your sex that you're being and they decide to fire you. It's because of your sex. If you were just a woman, they wouldn't have. You had remained a woman. They wouldn't. In the case that was before the court, if that person had remained a woman, they would not have been fired. All right. So, and Linda Greenhouse is also a writer at the Times, right? We'll soon find out whether the court inflames the culture wars or cools them as its term winds down, right? Very interesting, because I think what it seems to me is that the court, and I think this comes from Linda Greenhouse, right? The court seems aware that their role here has become, in sort of an odd way, referee of the United States, and so. And as we've all probably seen, sports games, kids, the classic, the thing in when I used to coach hockey was that if the referees didn't call enough penalties, right, then things turned into a free-for-all. And so the Supreme Court has to decide if they really want our national life to be a free-for-all or not. Okay, so Monday's momentous Supreme Court decision protecting LGBTQ people against workplace discrimination was so big that it crashed the court's computer system. For nearly half an hour, those of us at home, anxiously refreshing our browsers, knew that the decision had come down, but could download only the first page of the headnote, the official summary. Held, an employee who fires an individual merely for being gay or transgender violates Title VII. But who wrote the opinion? And what was the vote? Eventually, of course, the surprises were revealed. Justice Neil Gorsuch and 6-3. In the few days since then, I've been pondering, what do people need to know about Bostock v. Clayton County beyond its bottom line? And where in this mammoth set of opinions, a modest 33 pages for Justice Gorsuch, but an indigestible 135 pages for the dissent, does the decision's beating heart lie? The legal academic blogs are full of vigorous debates over who, in this dispute over statutory meaning, was the more authentic textualist. And this is what Naomi was getting at. And Justice Gorsuch, who called his conclusions the necessary consequence of the starkly broad language Congress chose 56 years ago, when it prohibited employment discrimination because of sex. Right? Or Justice Samuel Alito, whose reasoning boils down to two sentences in his long opinion's second paragraph. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits employment discrimination on any of 5 specified grounds: race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Justice Alito wrote, neither sexual orientation nor gender identity appears on that list. Justice Clarence Thomas signed Justice Alito's opinion. The other dissenter, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, oddly faulted Justice Gorsuch for giving the phrase discrimination because of sex too literal a meaning, as opposed to what Justice Kavanaugh deemed its ordinary meaning, that happens, in his view, not to include gay or trans. Okay. All right, very interesting sort of textual play. I'll leave the textualism debate to my academic colleagues. I want to talk about the sharply contrasting vantage points from which the majority and the dissent, and here I refer to Justice Alito, since Justice Kavanaugh's opinion added nothing of moment, viewed the issue, whether from the past, present, or future. These clashing perspectives, more than a debate over the canons of statutory interpretation, help explain the decision and may even help in understanding a court that defied most expectations with this decision and might do so again. Justice Gorsuch anchored his opinion in the world of today. The past and the future are not the majority's concerns. Very important, right? What's happening now in the country, right, is what's really important. The history of this set of issues is less important to him, right? The cases involve no more than the straightforward application of legal terms with plain and settled meanings, he said. That those who wrote those terms into law might not have expected them to apply as the court was now applying them made no difference. The language they wrote is the language they wrote, and the limits of the drafter's imagination supply no reason to ignore the law's demands. As for the future, Justice Gorsuch said, whether other policies and practices might or might not qualify as unlawful discrimination or find justifications under other provisions of Title VII are questions for future cases, not these, right? So he's not going to get into a slippery slope argument, right? He's going to say this is what this situation is, and when another situation arises, well, we'll deal with it at that point. Okay. Justice Alito's dissenting opinion, by contrast, was all about the past, of which he appeared almost willfully ignorant, and the future, of which he seemed terrified. First, the past. Statutes consist of communications between members of a particular linguistic community, one that existed in a particular place and at a particular time, and these communications must therefore be interpreted as they were understood by that community at the time. Justice Alito wrote, okay, so very different, right? A very different understanding of, well, what is textualism, right? Is textualism, right? Well, whatever the statute meant to the people who wrote it, right? Because that's the linguistic community, right? Or whatever the text means, whatever the text as it was written, right, may mean today, right? The range of sex now is a much broader range of things that do include now things like gender identity and sexual orientation. Okay. All right. In 1964, ordinary Americans reading the text of Title VII would not have dreamed that discrimination because of sex meant discrimination because of sexual orientation, much less gender identity. He added that these exotic understandings, I love that, exotic understandings of sex discrimination. I don't understand how an understanding of sex discrimination can be exotic, but I don't anyway, would not have crossed their minds. He further observed that in 1964, homosexuality was regarded as a mental disorder, and transgender was a concept that was essentially unknown to the public at that time. Right? All right. So I'm not sure if he's suggesting that since it was considered a mental disorder, that we should continue to treat it like a mental disorder, right? Even though that's been thoroughly debunked. I'm not really sure, but it's a little bit hair-raising. My suggestion of willful ignorance stems from this passage in Justice Alito's opinion. Title VII prohibits discrimination because of sex itself, not everything that is related to, based on, or defined with reference to sex. Many things are related to sex. Think of all the nouns other than orientation that are commonly modified by the adjective sexual. Some examples yielded by a quick computer search are sexual harassment, sexual assault, sexual violence, sexual intercourse, and sexual content. Does the court really think that Title VII prohibits discrimination on all of these grounds? Justice Alito's computer evidently didn't inform him that in 1986, 24 years after the passage of Title VII, the Supreme Court recognized sexual harassment as a form of sex discrimination. The case was Meritor Savings Bank versus Vincent. The opinion was by William Rehnquist, at the time an associate justice and the court's most conservative member, and the vote was 9-0. Sexual harassment had not entered the lexicon until 1979, when a law professor, Catherine McKinnon, published a path-breaking book, Sexual Harassment of Working Women. Years of feminist activism followed in an effort to incorporate the concept into existing law, right? So 7 years from coining the term to having it included as a valid form of sexual discrimination is pretty impressive. In fact, the Supreme Court has consistently read Title VII generously to cover situations that were surely not on the screen of the statute's sponsors. The unanimous opinion by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor in 1993 adopted a broad definition of a workplace atmosphere so hostile or abusive as to amount to sex discrimination. And in 1998, another unanimous opinion, this time by Justice Antonin Scalia, the patron saint of judicial textualism, held that Title VII covers sexual harassment when both perpetrator and victim are of the same sex. Sourced by the majority opinions highlighting of that precedent on Kale versus Sundower Offshore Services to acknowledge its existence, Justice Alito dismissed it as thoroughly unremarkable. Given his omission of the Meritor Savings Bank precedent 23 pages earlier in his opinion, Justice Alito's explanation for why the Oncale case proved nothing was remarkable indeed. That, after all, the court had already established that sexual harassment was covered by Title VII. So much for the past. And what about the future? The man is not lacking in imagination. Justice Alito offered a 10-page checklist of what to fear from the Bostock decision, among them bathrooms. Citing a brief, this bathroom thing comes up over and over and over again, and I'm so grateful to Jennifer Finney Boylan for pointing out that more Republican congressmen have been responsible for mischief in the than trans women. I just love that. Citing a brief filed by an organization called Defend My Privacy, he warned that for women who have been victimized by sexual assault or abuse, the experience of seeing an unclothed person with the anatomy of a male in a confined and sensitive location, such as a bathroom or locker room, can cause serious psychological harm. And then there is free speech. The court's decision may also pressure employers to suppress any statements by employees expressing disapproval of same-sex relationships and sex reassignment procedures. I don't know about that. That just seems like politeness, but whatever. And of course, Justice Alito worried about its impact on freedom of religion, a subject that deeply engages the court in any event. Within the next few weeks, the court will decide 2 cases on the scope of the so-called ministerial exception, a judicially created concept that exempts churches and religious institutions from having to abide by federal anti-discrimination laws for some categories of employees. Which categories? Ministers, obviously, but football coaches at religious schools, lay classroom teachers, receptionists, That's what the court will tell us shortly. Without doubt, this week's decision heightens the significance of those imminent rulings, given the receptivity justices showed during oral arguments to very broad application of the exception. Based on last month's argument in the two cases, I don't expect to be cheering the results. But Monday's decision is something to cheer, even if there proved to be holes in the web of legal protections that 6 justices have cast over a group of people who not very long ago were, to paraphrase the retired Justice Anthony Kennedy, strangers to the law. We are all made better off by the court's insistence that Title VII protects individuals. Title VII liability is not limited to employers who, through the sum of all their employment actions, treat the class of men differently than the class of women, Judge Gorsuch wrote. Instead, the law makes each instance of discriminating against an individual employee because of that individual's sex an independent violation of Title VII. Right? So, which is an interesting thing to think about. We do have a tendency in this country to think only about individual cases, right? But in this case, it does seem that that this does allow, this kind of an argument allows people to know that they individually are in a protected group. Just because they happen to be a transgender person doesn't exclude them from the group of people who are protected. What does it mean to say that the Bostock decision is anchored in today's world? More than 200 major employers told the justices in a brief they filed on behalf of the gay and transgender plaintiffs that a quiet revolution is taking place with the stamp of approval of the establishment of which they are a part. As the court was considering the case following last October's argument, a gay man was running a credible campaign for a major party's presidential nomination. In the next few weeks, we will learn, among other things, whether the court will abide by its precedents on abortions. But a series of surprise decisions have dominated the past weeks. On Monday, over the dissenting votes of Justices Thomas and Alito, the court refused to hear the Trump administration's challenge to California's sanctuary city policy, which protects immigrants in state detention from being turned over to federal officers. The court had the administration's petition under active consideration since January before denying it without explanation. In another action on Monday, only Justices Thomas and Kavanaugh were left to complain when the court, to the surprise of nearly everyone, turned down 10 Second Amendment petitions that would have given what once looked like an eager majority a chance to further expand individual gun rights. Then on Thursday, the court blocked the Trump administration's effort to end the Obama administration's program that protects hundreds of thousands of young immigrants known as Dreamers from deportation. The 5-4 decision, with the majority opinion by Chief Justice Roberts, offered the White House a chance to justify the termination on firmer legal grounds. But at the same time, the Chief Justice appeared to doom such an effort to failure by stressing the need to take into account the reliant interests of the young people who have used the opportunity to deepen their roots in the only country they have known by finishing schools, building families, and contributing to the economy. Random events or straws in the wind, evidence that the justices have decided to do their part to cool the culture wars rather than inflame them? Well, we will see soon enough. Reading Justice Gorsuch's Bostock opinion, I was thrown back to the summer of 2017 when I found myself in a social gathering of a half-dozen fellow progressives and one prominent conservative lawyer with whom we were all friendly. It was a civil but increasingly pointed conversation as we pressed the lawyer, first gently and then more firmly, on whether he actually supported the Muslim travel ban and other actions of the Trump administration's opening month that troubled the rest of us. He took the bait in good humor, but finally, all but throwing up his hands, he cut the conversation off. Look, he said, we got Gorsuch. Yes, we did. All right, so I invite comment, as always. Go ahead, Gene. You have to unmute yourself, though. Go ahead, yeah.
I wanted to say kind of 2 historical footnotes first. One is that at the time of the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the word sex was thrown in at the last minute in an effort to get the law defeated. So it was not anything that was put in after a great deal
Wow,
of thoughtful deliberation.
that's really interesting.
Secondly, Gorsuch was a clerk for Anthony Kennedy, and it was Kennedy who is responsible for the decisions in a number of the cases related to gay rights. So I don't think it should have been such a surprise that
Right.
Gorsuch came out on this side, although Kavanaugh was a clerk for him too, but Gorsuch, I think, really may have absorbed Kennedy's perspective on this.
Right. There was actually an article a couple of weeks ago saying essentially that not just the Kennedy thing, but also that he was a judge based in Boulder, Colorado, which is one of the most liberal places you'll find, and so probably among his friends and acquaintances were a large number of gay, lesbian, transgender, queer people. So go ahead, Naomi. Go ahead, Gene. I'm sorry.
The third thing I was going to say relates to that, and that is that I think the Supreme Court is often more attuned to what's going on in society than we might think. And I think that's reflected in this case.
I mean,
And also
certainly more. Go ahead.
And also the
I
docket.
did this. Yes, right. I mean, and also it feels to me also like Congress and certainly this administration are sometimes willfully out of step with what's going on in the world, and of course we know that this president loves to fan the flames. He likes to get other people crazy as much as possible. So it would be wonderful if we could have a president that wasn't focused on that all the time, but we can hope. Go ahead, Naomi. You're still muted, though.
Oh dear. I felt that the California decision, which was also, I think, 7-2, was a really significant one because it basically means that under the federal system, there is a limit to how far the feds can clobber the states into cooperation. There are a lot of ways they can do it, but that seemed to reinforce the ability of a state to defy the federal government on some grounds.
Right.
And I'm not sure, maybe our hopes for Gorsuch are overblown, but just remember way back when Earl Warren became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Eisenhower was pretty disappointed because he thought he was appointing a moderate to conservative person. There's something about being on the court that tends to transform people. But again,
Yeah.
I let's not pin too much hope on Gorsuch. I have more hope for Roberts. And
Yeah, well, Roberts is such an institutionalist that it's.
Yeah, right. The Supreme Court reads the election returns.
Yeah.
So,
No, I mean, and I do think that you're right. I think that the Supreme Court recognizes that if it goes, they probably, there was an element that this sort of happened with Roe v. Wade, right? Is that there was sort of a sense that the court got too far ahead in certain ways of the country, and that led to kind of a pushback on this. And so they, you don't want to. They probably are very aware that if they willy-nilly go completely in a reactionary direction, that they could lose their authority. Yeah. Go ahead, Barbara.
No, I wasn't trying to say anything.
Oh, okay. Would anyone else like to? Mimi?
Sorry.
Go ahead. And who's on the phone with us at 0549?
Hey, it's me, Rabbi Jim Sheila.
Sheila. Oh, great. Okay, wonderful. You have two boxes instead of one. Yeah.
Oh.
Would you like to add something to the conversation?
I would. I was just listening to C-SPAN yesterday, and they were talking about should the federal government interfere with police practices. And there was a big discussion about this where people were saying the federal government has no right telling the state what to do. And they said this is the state's decision whether or not to enter into contracts with the police. And they were saying the federal government has no right to interfere with the contract. I think this is very interesting. I think Title VII shows the federal government does have the power to do it and should do it.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, the fate of policing consent decrees under this administration is a major debacle.
Yeah.
And, you know, the fact that the Justice Department just decided to withdraw all of their guidance from these police departments that wanted to help. And, you know, we're in fights, I guess, I don't know, with police unions. I'm not even sure where the opposition was coming from, but it was rather frustrating that this was the way it went. But yeah, no, I'll be very interested to see what happens with these remaining decisions, and if there is if the court sort of Roberts in particular, if he begins to sort of essentially have to moderate himself in order to maintain his maintain the legitimacy of the court. Worse things could happen.
Rabbi,
So what's coming up?
Go ahead, Sandy. Did you want to say something?
absolutely. We have not discussed the discrimination against women that goes back very far. When I got
Well-
a job at AT&T in 1957, there were 2 women in that engineering department. And we make much less money than the men did.
Oh yes.
And that
Oh, yes.
propelled me to go into investments where if you buy or you sell, they don't care about your sex.
Yeah, I mean obviously as Jean pointed out, right? Sex discrimination has not only been rampant in our history, it's also been even till this day, it is somehow still socially acceptable. Women make something like 75 cents for every dollar that men make, for the same job. So it's an ongoing disgrace, to be sure. And so but I think that as with the case of J.K. Rowling showed, right, is that there's always a need to try to expand the circle of people who are protected, right, rather than closing it off, in expanding the circle of people who are accepted as being fully human. Right, we live in a country that for way too many years didn't even bother to pretend, right, that they didn't consider African Americans somehow less than human, right? And this is the same kind of discrimination against transgender people, especially transgender people, but also all queer people, right? Is that somehow they are less than human, right? Because they don't fit into one of the categories that that the person that's discriminating against considers legitimately human categories. So yeah.
I'd like to
Sandy.
add something else. The
Please.
religions, including Judaism, the position of women is anything but equal.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right, and it's one of the reasons we're constantly, in our tradition, in the Jewish tradition, and I know this is true for many of my Christian colleagues as well, I'm less familiar with this in a Muslim context, so I can't speak to it. But I know that most of my Jewish colleagues that I'm friendly with, and a good number of the Christian colleagues that I have, are actively push back against traditional interpretations of our texts to try to level that field in ways that we can. Establishing right from our sacred texts, right, that women and men were created equally in the image of God, right? So it's
Right.
which is not to say that we have not had a terrible history of subjugating women. All right, so Mimi unmuted herself, but Sheila, I think you wanted to say something.
I just wanted to say, I wanted to tell you, the Equal Rights Amendment failed in the United States, but it was passed in Massachusetts. So we do have a law against sex discrimination in Massachusetts, and it's been on the books since about 1964.
Right. Thank you. Go ahead, Mimi.
I just want to add that here at CCB, when Rhonda first, or whoever, first put out the who we're not going to discriminate against, the LGBT rights was not in that. I had to call her up and say, Rhonda, hello. And she did respond. She did respond, and she always does. But, that's pretty recent.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Good for you.
Yeah, this is, I'm sorry?
Good for Mimi.
Say again, G?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank God you were here, Mimi, to
Right.
guide her back onto the track. But this is an ongoing problem in many senior living facilities where the management has not made enough of they've not made it sufficiently clear that discrimination against queer people is not to be tolerated. So there are a number of people that when they move into a senior housing facility, they feel like they need to go back into the closet. And it's, we have our institutional stance is clear at HSL. But obviously individuals are individuals, and the community, it's an ongoing struggle to make sure that people feel like they can be who they are in our communities. So, all right, Mimi, you get the last word. I think you wanted to say something.
Well, I don't know. Okay, last word. It's even more recent than that when they put out that survey about people's housing preferences when talking about having a new building. When Rhonda was presenting that to the community, I pointed out to her that there was not one word about diversity or LGBT questions. So that was like 6 months ago. So yeah, it just takes, you have to just keep plugging.
Keep plugging. Yeah, Randy, do you want to say something? Okay, good. All right, well, thank you, everybody. Someone just joined us on the phone. Who are you? Who's this? 8419? I guess they're not with us anymore. Okay. All right, well, thank you. I'm sorry that we ran late. At 7 tonight, I'm going to have the class on the David story. Feel free to join us. And then at 8:30, we'll have a little evening service with songs and lullabies and stuff like that. So feel free again to sign on for either of those two programs. Okay, thanks a lot, everyone.